Somewhere in Armenia, in a scriptorium that no longer stands, a monk picked up his reed pen and began copying a document that much of the Christian world had already set aside. It was not one of the four Gospels. It was not a letter from Paul. It was something stranger, a courtroom account, written as though someone had attended the trial of Jesus of Nazareth with a clear view of the proceedings and a careful eye for detail. It named witnesses. It recorded exchanges. It included a formal letter from Pontius Pilate to the Emperor of Rome describing what had happened and why. The document was called the Acts of Pilate. In the Latin West, it was classified as apocryphal, useful perhaps for devotional reading, but not scripture, not authoritative, and not, as the centuries passed, particularly worth copying. In Armenia, scholars examining the manuscript tradition of medieval Christianity have found something very different. The Acts of Pilate was one of the most common apocryphal writings in medieval Armenia. Not a curiosity, not a rarity held by one monastery in one province. One of the most common, copied from the mountains of Sionic to the fortress scriptoria of Cilicia, generation after generation, as though Armenian Christianity had decided this document belonged alongside the Gospels rather than below them. To understand why, you have to understand what Armenia was. In the early 4th century, a king named Tiridates III made a decision no head of state had ever made. He declared Christianity the official religion of his kingdom, the Kingdom of Greater Armenia, and in doing so, he made his nation the first in the history of the world to adopt Christianity as a state religion. The traditional date for this conversion is 301 CE. Many modern scholars place it closer to 314. The exact year is disputed, the range is narrow, and the result is the same regardless of where within it you land. Armenia became Christian before Rome, before Byzantium, before any of the great Mediterranean powers that would later define the shape of the faith. The story of how that conversion happened is its own kind of document. Tiridates had spent years persecuting the Christians in his kingdom. He had a missionary named Gregory thrown into a pit, a deep stone cell carved into the earth near the foot of Mount Ararat, a place still known today as Khor Virap. Gregory spent 14 years in that hole, kept alive, as tradition holds, by a Christian widow who secretly lowered bread to him. Then the king's sister had a vision. Then Tiridates fell ill. Then Gregory was released, the king recovered, and Armenia became the first Christian nation on earth. Gregory the Illuminator, as he is known, born around 257, died around 331, became the first head of the Armenian Apostolic Church. Tiridates, the man who had imprisoned him, became the first Christian king. Whatever one makes of the details of the conversion, the institutional fact is undeniable. By the time Constantine was issuing edicts of tolerance in the Roman Empire, Armenia had already been a Christian kingdom for somewhere between 1 and 15 years, depending on which scholarly date you accept. An early Christian nation needs an early Christian text, and that is where the story of the Armenian manuscripts becomes not just interesting but textually important. Sometime around 405 CE, a monk and scholar named Mesrop Mashtots completed something that had never existed before, a written alphabet for the Armenian language. Working with a Greek calligrapher named Rufanos of Samosata, Mashtots devised 36 letters that could represent every sound in Armenian, a language that until then had no written form of its own. Within a year, he and a scholar named Sahak had begun translating the Bible into it. The first Armenian New Testament was completed somewhere between 406 and 414 CE. Its initial base was an old Syriac text, a textual tradition that runs parallel to the Greek manuscripts and, in some places, predates them. After the Council of Ephesus in 431 CE, the Armenian Church obtained new Greek manuscripts and revised the translation. What resulted was a Bible with a layered textual ancestry, drawing on Syriac traditions, early Greek witnesses, and a moment of scholarly revision that gave Armenian scribes access to manuscript families the Latin West would never see. This matters because the Armenian Bible is not simply a translation of a translation. It is a branch from an earlier fork in the textual tree. When an Armenian scribe of the 9th century sat down to copy Mark's Gospel, he was working from a tradition whose roots were in sources predating Jerome's Vulgate. When that same scribe copied the Acts of Pilate alongside it, as Armenian scribes did, widely and repeatedly, he was treating a document that most of Western Christianity had stopped copying, as though it belonged in the same breath as the canonical text. Today, that tradition of preservation lives in a building on a hillside in Yerevan. The Matenadaran, the Mesrop Mashtot's Institute of Ancient Manuscripts, holds over 23,000 manuscripts and 500,000 additional documents. It is the largest repository of Armenian manuscripts in the world. Among its holdings is the Zaytun Gospels, catalogued as MS 10,450, produced in 1256 CE at the scriptorium of the Hromkla fortress in Cilician Armenia. The man who made it was an illuminator named Toros Roslin, born around 1210, died around 1270, who is regarded by art historians as the most significant Armenian manuscript painter of the medieval period. He made the Zaytun Gospels for Catholicos Constantine I, the head of the Armenian Church. He filled it with images that, as we will examine, sometimes depict the Passion of Christ in ways that no other Eastern Christian artist of his era would paint. The Gladzor Gospels, produced around 1300 in the monastery of Gladzor in the Armenian province of Syunik, now held at UCLA on loan from the Armenian Patriarchate of Jerusalem, contains 55 miniature scenes from the life of Christ, more than most comparable manuscripts of the period. The Red Gospels of Ganjasar, dated by its oldest inscription to 1237 CE, contains a crucifixion image whose theological implications scholars have debated for decades. These are not marginal documents. They are the surviving evidence of a tradition of engagement with the Passion story that is older, broader, and in several specific ways more detailed than the tradition the Western Church inherited, which raises the question that the next 5 chapters will attempt to answer. The 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, record the final week of Jesus' life with a level of detail that is, by the standards of ancient biography, remarkable. They also contradict each other at documented points that are not trivial. The dates of specific events within the week differ. The witness lists differ. The sequence of the trials differs. There are scenes that appear in only one of the 4 Gospels, as though the other 3 writers simply didn't have access to them. And then there is the Armenian tradition, which for over 1,000 years treated a 5th account, one that the rest of Christianity classified as apocryphal, as the most widely copied Passion text in its scriptoria, an account attributed in Armenian manuscripts to James, the Lord's brother, an account that includes a letter from Pontius Pilate to the Emperor Tiberius that the 4 canonical Gospels never mention. The final week begins on a Sunday. All 4 Gospels agree on that. What happened between that Sunday and the following Sunday morning is a question that 4 writers answered 4 different ways, and that the monks of the world's first Christian nation, for reasons preserved in their manuscripts, if not always in their words, apparently believed deserved a 5th. The last moment of clean consensus is a Sunday morning in spring. On the road descending from the Mount of Olives toward the eastern gate of Jerusalem, a man rides into the city on the back of a young donkey. The crowd around him is enormous. Pilgrims in from the countryside for Passover. People who have heard what happened recently in the nearby village of Bethany. Followers who have walked with him for days through Judea. They spread their cloaks on the road. They cut branches from palm trees and wave them overhead or lay them across the path. They shout. The noise carries into the city. All 4 canonical Gospels record this entry, and all 4 describe essentially the same scene. Matthew 21, 1 through 11, Mark 11, 1 through 11, Luke 19, 28 through 44, John 12, 12 through 19. 4 accounts, 4 sets of witnesses, 1 event, and for the last time in the account we are examining, all 4 writers are telling it the same way. Jesus of Nazareth enters Jerusalem on the day that Christians have called Palm Sunday for 2,000 years. The crowd pressing around him is fulfilling, without knowing it, a prophecy from the book of Zechariah. See, your king comes to you, righteous and victorious, lowly and riding on a donkey. He is, by the most careful scholarly reconstruction of his birth and the most widely accepted date for the crucifixion that follows, somewhere between 35 and 36 years old. He has, at this moment, approximately 6 days left to live. It is the only point in the final week at which all 4 writers agree. What Monday does to that consensus is instructive. 3 of the 4 Gospels place a specific event on the morning after the triumphal entry. Jesus enters the temple courts, the vast, colonnaded complex on the Temple Mount administered by the chief priests, and drives out the merchants and money changers who have set up trade operations inside its outer courts. He overturns the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. He quotes the prophets, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you have made it a den of robbers." Matthew records this in chapter 21, Mark in chapter 11, Luke in chapter 19. 3 accounts of the same act, placed at the same moment in the same week. Then there is John. In John's Gospel, the temple cleansing appears not during the final week at all, but at the beginning of Jesus' public ministry, in chapter 2, verses 13 through 16. The same overturned tables, the same scattered coins, the same declaration about the house of prayer, but positioned at a different Passover, years before Palm Sunday, at the very beginning of Jesus' public life. Scholars have studied this divergence for centuries. The majority of them settle on one of 2 conclusions. Either John deliberately repositioned the temple cleansing for theological reasons, to announce Jesus' identity and mission at the outset of his gospel rather than bury it late in the week, or there were genuinely 2 separate incidents, one early in the ministry and one near the end, and the synoptic writers recorded one while John recorded the other. Both explanations require accepting that at least one of the 4 canonical writers either rearranged the historical sequence or described an event that the other 3 simply did not include. Neither conclusion is a minor one. Both tell you the same thing. The 4 Gospels were never a single unified account of the same week. They were always 4 separate accounts. And on the question of when Jesus cleansed the temple, 3 of the 4 are in disagreement with the 4th. The temple cleansing is the second problem. The first happened before Jesus even arrived in Jerusalem. The village of Bethany lies on the eastern slope of the Mount of Olives, a short walk from the city gate. The Gospels tell us it was the home of Lazarus, Mary, and Martha, and that during Holy Week, Jesus returned there each evening, walking back into Jerusalem each morning. Mark chapter 11, verses 11 through 12 and 19 through 20, makes this daily pattern explicit: out to Bethany for the night, back to the temple courts by morning. Bethany is where the week is anchored. It is also where an unnamed woman approached Jesus with an alabaster jar of expensive perfume, broke the jar, and poured the contents over his head. Matthew records this anointing in chapter 26, verses 6 through 13. Mark records it in chapter 14, verses 3 through 9. Both writers place the event 2 days before Passover, later in the week, after the temple confrontations, during the same stretch of time when the betrayal is also being arranged. Two closely related writers agreeing on the date. Then, for the second time, John disagrees. In John 12:1 through 8, the anointing at Bethany occurs 6 days before Passover, the day before the triumphal entry. In John's account, the woman who anoints Jesus is Mary, the sister of Lazarus and Martha, and the perfume is a pound of expensive nard. The scene takes place at a dinner in their house in Bethany, the night before the crowd lines the road with palm branches. In John's timeline, this is the opening act of Holy Week. In Matthew and Mark's timeline, it happens 4 days later. The same jar, the same act, the same village, placed by different writers on days that cannot be reconciled into a single calendar without one or more of the accounts being rearranged or wrong. Scholars have formally designated the Bethany anointing as a documented irreconcilable chronological divergence between the canonical Gospels, meaning that after centuries of proposed harmonizations, no solution has satisfied the majority of historians. Something is missing from the record. Some event, some detail, some thread connecting the 4 accounts has been lost, moved, or never written down. By Wednesday of that week, a shadow that none of the 4 Gospel writers explains falls across the story. All 3 synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, record the same transaction. One of the 12 disciples who had been traveling with Jesus throughout his ministry goes privately to the chief priests. He asks what they will pay him to hand Jesus over to them. They offer 30 pieces of silver. He agrees. Matthew 26:14 through 16 records the exchange and notes that the price fulfills a prophecy from the book of Zechariah, chapter 11, verse 12, the 30 pieces of silver paid for the shepherd. Mark records the same agreement in chapter 14, verses 10 through 11, without stating the amount. Luke records it in chapter 22, verses 3 through 6, adding only that something entered the betrayer before he went to the priests. The 4th Gospel, John, does not record this Wednesday transaction at all. There it is again. 3 accounts that agree on an event, and a 4th that simply omits it. Not contradicts it, omits it. John does not say the meeting with the chief priests did not happen. John says nothing about it. That silence is its own kind of evidence. What we now have, before Thursday has begun, before any arrest, before any trial, is a canonical record of the final week that has already fractured in 3 distinct places, an event relocated across years, an anointing unmoored from its date, a betrayal agreement witnessed by 3 writers and invisible to the 4th. These are not peripheral details. They are load-bearing events in the story of how Jesus came to be put on trial, and they are already irreconcilable within the 4 texts that every branch of Christianity accepts as authoritative. When medieval Armenian scribes copied the Acts of Pilate alongside those 4 Gospels, treating it as the most widely reproduced passion text in their tradition. They were not adding a foreign document to a clean and unified story. They were adding a fifth layer to something that was already, by any honest accounting, incomplete. The Armenian Manuscript does not arrive at a solved problem. It arrives at an open one. Thursday is coming, and in a garden across the Kidron Valley from the city walls, one of the 4 Gospels is about to know something the other 3 have already forgotten. Thursday evening begins in an unnamed room. The 4 canonical Gospels agree that Jesus of Nazareth shared a Passover meal with his 12 disciples somewhere in Jerusalem on the night before his arrest. Beyond that agreement, the accounts diverge almost immediately. Matthew, Mark, and Luke describe a meal centered on the institution of the Eucharist, the breaking of bread and the pouring of wine as a covenant, a ritual Jesus tells his disciples to repeat in memory of him. They record his prediction that one of the 12 will betray him, and his warning to a particular disciple that before the rooster crows that night, that disciple will deny knowing him 3 times. John records all of that, and then keeps going for 4 more chapters. The upper room in John's Gospel is a different kind of space than the one in the Synoptics. Before the meal begins, Jesus removes his outer garment, wraps a towel around his waist, kneels, and washes the feet of each disciple in turn. None of the 3 synoptic writers records this scene. Not a condensed version, not a reference to it. Nothing. Then, after the meal, John records a farewell discourse that runs from chapter 14 through chapter 17. 4 chapters of teaching, reassurance, and prayer, a document that Matthew, Mark, and Luke omit entirely. Whether those writers knew about it and chose not to include it, or whether the tradition John drew on had access to material the others did not, is a question scholars have not resolved. The room itself is described only as a large upper room, furnished and ready. Mark chapter 14, verse 15, echoed in Luke chapter 22, verse 12. Its location in Jerusalem is not given. Its owner is not named. The room where the Eucharist was instituted is anonymous, and the 4 accounts of what happened inside it are not the same account. After the meal, they leave the city. Across the Kidron Valley on the lower western slope of the Mount of Olives lies an olive grove. John chapter 18 verse 1 describes the group going there. A place, John adds in verse 2, where Jesus often went with his disciples. Matthew names it Gethsemane in chapter 26 verse 36. Mark uses the same name in chapter 14 verse 32. The garden sits just beyond Jerusalem's eastern wall, separated from the city by the shallow ravine of the Kidron, familiar enough to Jesus and his disciples that someone who wanted to find him there would know exactly where to look. Jesus goes deeper into the grove to pray. The disciples sleep. He wakes them, returns to pray again. Matthew and Mark record this happening 3 times. Luke describes him withdrawing about a stone's throw away and praying once. John does not describe the prayer at all, only the arrival, and then immediately the crowd coming through the gate. A torchlit crowd coming through the gate of the garden. John chapter 18 verse 3 is the most specific of the 4 accounts. A detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. Matthew and Mark describe a large crowd armed with swords and clubs, sent from the chief priests and elders. Luke says chief priests and officers of the temple guard. Leading all of them is one of the 12, the one who had made his arrangement with the priests earlier in the week, whose name the synoptics give, but whose reasons they do not explain. He identifies Jesus with a kiss. The arrest begins. Someone draws a sword. 3 of the 4 Gospels record the moment. and not one of them names the swordsman. Matthew chapter 26, verse 51. One of Jesus' companions reached for his sword. Mark chapter 14, verse 47. One of those standing near drew his sword. Luke chapter 22, verse 50. One of them struck the servant of the high priest, cutting off his right ear. One of those nearby. 3 witnesses to the same event, and between them they cannot produce a name. They know a sword was drawn and an ear was cut. They know the ear belonged to the servant of the high priest, but who held the sword has vanished from their accounts, along with the name of the man who lost the ear. Then there is John. John chapter 18, verse 10. Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. 2 names in one sentence, both absent from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The swordsman was Simon Peter, fisherman from Bethsaida, one of the first men Jesus had called to follow him, at this point around 30 years old. The man whose ear was cut was named Malchus. John knows both names. The other 3 writers know neither. The accounts divide again immediately. 3 of the 4 record that an ear was cut in a garden in the dark. Only one records what happened to it afterward. Luke chapter 22, verse 51, and only Luke chapter 22, verse 51. Jesus reached out, touched the wounded ear, and healed it. Matthew does not record a healing. Mark does not record a healing. John, who just named the man whose ear it was, does not record a healing. Luke, who did not name anyone in the scene, records that the ear was healed. John has the names. Luke has the healing. No single gospel has both. Each one is carrying a piece of the night that the others dropped. The arrest proceeds. The disciples scatter. Mark chapter 14, verse 50 says all of them fled. All of them, except one. Simon Peter follows the crowd at a distance toward the house of the high priest. He gets inside the courtyard and stands near a charcoal fire. Jesus has been taken inside. All 4 Gospels record what happens at that fire, and it is one of the very few moments in the entire Passion narrative where all 4 are in agreement about what happened and how many times it happened. A servant girl looks at Peter and says, "You were with that man." Peter says he does not know what she means. Someone else looks at him. "You are one of them." He denies it. A third person presses him. "You must be. Your accent gives you away." He denies it a 3rd time. A rooster crows. Matthew 26, 69 through 75. Mark 14, 66 through 72. Luke 22, 54 through 62. John 18, 15 through 27. The fisherman from Bethsaida, who had been willing to put a sword in his hand an hour earlier, cannot say his own name to a servant girl at a fire. He walks out into the dark. Inside the house, the accounts begin to split for the last time that night. John chapter 18, verses 12 through 24, contains a scene that Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention at all. Before Jesus is brought to the high priest Caiaphas, he is first taken to Annas, Caiaphas's father-in-law, a former high priest who had held the office years earlier. Annas questions him about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answers. One of the guards standing nearby strikes Jesus for his answer. Annas then sends him, still bound, to Caiaphas. None of the 3 synoptic Gospels includes this examination. Annas does not appear in Matthew, Mark, or Luke during the trial. The question he asks is not recorded there. The blow Jesus receives for his answer is not recorded there. The scene exists in John alone. One more piece of the night that 3 writers either didn't know about or chose not to preserve. Peter is somewhere in the dark outside. Jesus is being passed from one high priest to another. The trial has begun, and the Armenian Manuscript tradition, which for 1,000 years treated a detailed account of what happened in that trial as the most widely copied passion text in its scriptoria, is about to enter the story. The trial of Jesus of Nazareth has been recorded 4 times. The 4 records do not agree. The disagreement begins before any formal proceeding. When Jesus is led away bound from Gethsemane, John's Gospel takes him somewhere the other 3 writers do not acknowledge. To the house of Annas, the former high priest and father-in-law of Caiaphas, who had held the high priestly office years earlier and still carried authority in the priestly establishment. John chapter 18, verses 12 through 24, records a preliminary examination. Annas questions Jesus about his disciples and his teaching. Jesus answers by pointing to the public nature of his ministry. Everything he taught openly. A guard strikes him for his answer. Annas sends him, still bound, to Caiaphas. Matthew, Mark, and Luke do not mention Annas. They do not record this examination. They do not record the blow. In those 3 accounts, Jesus moves from the arrest directly to the high priest's house, and the high priest is Caiaphas. The preliminary stop at Annas exists in one gospel alone, and the trial record is already incomplete before it has formally begun. From Annas, Jesus is taken to Caiaphas. Matthew chapter 26, verses 57 through 68. Mark chapter 14, verses 53 through 65. Luke chapter 22, verses 63 through 71. The Sanhedrin is convened. Witnesses are called. The witnesses, Matthew and Mark note, contradict each other. The high priest asks Jesus directly whether he is the Messiah. Jesus answers. The high priest tears his robes. The council declares the charge warrants death. John's Gospel does not include a Sanhedrin trial. John moves from Annas to Pilate without recording any formal council proceeding, without the assembled witnesses, without the tearing of robes. The scene that Matthew and Mark give 2 full chapters of material to simply does not exist in the 4th Gospel. John has Annas. The Synoptics have the Sanhedrin. Neither has what the other records. By the time Jesus arrives before the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate, who governed Judea from approximately AD 26 to 36 or 37, and was present in Jerusalem for Passover, the trial record has already split twice. The proceeding before Pilate, which all 4 writers include, is itself 4 different proceedings. Matthew chapter 27, verses 11 through 26. Mark chapter 15, verses 1 through 15. Luke chapter 23, verses 1 through 7 and 13 through 25. John chapter 18, verse 28 through chapter 19, verse 16. Pilate asks whether Jesus is the king of the Jews. Jesus says little. In John, the exchange inside the praetorium is extended. Pilate takes him inside, questions him about the nature of his kingdom, asks what truth is, goes back outside to address the crowd. John preserves more dialogue between Pilate and Jesus than the other 3 writers combined. Luke adds something none of the other 3 record. When Pilate learns that Jesus is Galilean, he sends him across the city to Herod Antipas, who governed Galilee and Perea and was in Jerusalem for the festival. Antipas was the son of Herod the Great, born around 20 BC, and therefore approximately 50 years old at the time of the trial. Luke chapter 23, verses 6 through 12, records that he had wanted to see Jesus for some time. He put his questions to him, one after another. Luke chapter 23, verse 9. Jesus gave him no answer. To none of Antipas's questions did he respond. Antipas and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked Jesus, Luke chapter 23 verse 11, and put an elegant robe on him. Then Antipas sent him back to Pilate. Luke adds that this exchange resolved some prior hostility between the two men, though neither the cause of the hostility nor the mechanism of the resolution is explained. This scene exists in Luke alone. It does not appear in Matthew, Mark, John, or the Armenian Acts of Pilate. It is canonical material belonging to a single gospel, one more exclusive scene in a trial, built entirely of exclusive scenes. John contributes Annas. Luke contributes Herod Antipas. Matthew and Mark give the Sanhedrin its full weight. John extends the Pilate dialogue further than the synoptics take it. The trial is not one account with 4 retellings. It is 4 partial accounts, assembled into a shape that contains, collectively, more than any one of them. And then there is the document, the Armenian tradition, preserved above all others. The Acts of Pilate, part 1 of what later Western Christianity called the Gospel of Nicodemus, exists in Greek, Latin, Syriac, Coptic, and Armenian versions. In medieval Armenia, it was one of the most widely copied apocryphal writings, not a rarity, not a monastery's private text, but a document reproduced across scriptoria from the Armenian highlands to the fortress libraries of Cilicia. The Armenian version has specific characteristics that set it apart from the Latin tradition. It contains an expanded interrogation record of Jesus before Pilate, more exchanges, more procedural detail than any of the 4 canonical Gospels preserve. It contains a formal epistle of Pilate to the Emperor Tiberius, a report from the Roman prefect to Rome describing what happened at the trial and what followed. And it carries an authorship attribution that appears in Armenian manuscripts, particularly later ones, that assigns the document not to Nicodemus and not to an anonymous scribe, but to James, the Lord's brother. What the Armenian Acts of Pilate does not contain is the descent into hell. The Latin and Western versions of the Gospel of Nicodemus include a second part, Christ descending to the realm of the dead between crucifixion and resurrection, releasing the souls of the righteous. That section is absent from the Armenian, Coptic, and Syriac versions entirely. The Armenian tradition preserved the legal record and stopped there. The Latin tradition preserved the theological elaboration and carried both. The difference in what each tradition chose to copy is its own kind of evidence about what each tradition considered essential. The Epistle of Pilate to Tiberius is the detail that sits at the center of what makes this document remarkable. The canonical Gospels show Pilate wash his hands before the crowd, a gesture recorded in Matthew chapter 27 verse 24, and in no other Gospel, release the insurrectionist Barabbas in Jesus' place and hand Jesus over to be executed. After that, the Pilate of the canonical record largely disappears. He grants the body for burial. He posts a guard at the tomb. He is not heard from again. A Roman prefect governing a volatile province did not operate without documentation. A man hailed by crowds as King of Israel, executed during Passover when the city was full of pilgrims whose followers would within weeks be proclaiming a resurrection. This was not the kind of case a prefect filed in silence. Someone wrote a report. Someone sent it toward Rome. The 4 canonical Gospels do not record that report. The Armenian Acts of Pilate does. Whether the Epistle of Pilate to Tiberius is a genuine first-century document or a later composition, scholars have not settled. What is documented is that Armenian Christians reproduced it widely, generation after generation, alongside their canonical Gospels in the world's first Christian nation. They preserved something the Latin West had appended to a supernatural narrative, and the Greek tradition had treated as secondary. Armenia preserved the trial. Armenia preserved the letter. And whatever that letter contains, it begins where the 4 canonical Gospels end, at the moment the prefect handed Jesus over. And then it keeps going. The disagreements begin again before the execution site is reached. After the condemnation, the soldiers lead Jesus out. 3 of the 4 Gospels record that they compelled a man they encountered along the way to carry the cross. Mark chapter 15, verse 21, identifies him precisely. Simon, from Cyrene in North Africa, coming in from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus. Matthew chapter 27, verse 32, and Luke chapter 23, verse 26 confirm the same account. A named man from a named city, compelled by the soldiers to carry the cross through Jerusalem toward the execution ground outside the walls. John chapter 19, verse 17 says Jesus went out carrying his own cross. Simon of Cyrene does not appear in John's Gospel. The most fundamental physical detail of the road to Golgotha, who bore the weight of the cross, is recorded differently by the 4th Gospel than by the other 3. In the Eastern Christian artistic tradition, Byzantine and Armenian alike, the image that became standard was Simon carrying the cross. That was the majority account, the version backed by 3 of the 4 writers. Centuries of Christian art reinforced it. Illuminated manuscripts across the Greek, Syriac, and Armenian traditions depicted Simon beside Jesus on the road, carrying the instrument of execution the soldiers had forced on him. Churches painted it. Theologians interpreted it. The image was settled. In 1256 CE, Toros Roslin painted it differently. In the Zeytun Gospels, MS 10,450, now held at the Matenadaran in Yerevan, folio 391 depicts the ascent to Calvary, with Christ carrying the cross himself, leaning under its weight as he climbs toward Golgotha. Simon of Cyrene is absent from the scene entirely. Roslin, regarded by scholars as the most accomplished manuscript illuminator in the Armenian tradition, did not paint the image that every earlier painter around him had painted. He painted what his text said. And his text, in that passage, followed John. The choice was not accidental. Roslin knew the standard image. He painted John's version because his text, at that passage, said John. The place the procession was heading was called Golgotha. All 4 Gospels name it. Matthew chapter 27, verse 33, and Mark chapter 15, verse 22 give the full designation, Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. John chapter 19, verse 17 uses the same Aramaic name. Luke chapter 23, verse 33 calls it simply the skull. The site lay just outside Jerusalem's walls to the northwest, a low rocky outcropping used for public executions, visible enough from the road to serve as a warning. The Church of the Holy Sepulchre marks the same ground today. Jesus of Nazareth was crucified at Golgotha. He was somewhere between 35 and 36 years old. He had entered Jerusalem 6 days earlier, to crowds who spread cloaks and palm branches across the road. Who stood at the foot of the cross when he died depends entirely on which gospel you read. Mark chapter 15, verse 40 names 3 women watching from a distance: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the younger and of Joseph, and Salome. John chapter 19, verse 25 names 4 figures standing near the cross itself: the mother of Jesus, her sister, Mary the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. Matthew chapter 27, verses 55 through 56 records: Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James and Joseph, and the mother of the sons of Zebedee. Luke chapter 23, verse 49. Names none of them, only the women who had followed Jesus from Galilee, standing at a distance. Mary Magdalene appears in Matthew, Mark, and John at the crucifixion. The mother of Jesus appears in John alone among the gospel accounts of the cross. Salome appears in Mark alone. The mother of the sons of Zebedee appears in Matthew alone. The witness rosters overlap at Mary Magdalene and diverge on nearly every other name. As with the arrest in the garden, as with the trial before Annas, as with the Herod Antipas interrogation, the canonical record cannot produce an agreed account of who was present at the most central event in the story it is trying to tell. The Armenian illuminated manuscript tradition preserved two distinct visual responses to the crucifixion that illuminate this problem from a different angle. The Zaytun Gospels, already discussed, is one. The Red Gospels of Ganjasar is the other. Earlier than the Zaytun Gospels by at least 2 decades, the Ganjasar manuscript's oldest surviving inscription dates to 1237 CE. It was held at the monastery of Ganjasar in the Zachen canton of Armenia. On folio 6 verso, its crucifixion scene contains a figure absent from Western Passion iconography, the personified church, painted as a female figure, holding a chalice beneath the wound in Christ's side. Into that chalice 2 streams flow, blood from the wound and water, both collected together in a single vessel. The image is an interpretation of John chapter 19, verse 34, which records that when a soldier pierced Jesus' side, blood and water came out. That detail appears in John alone among the 4 Gospels, but scholars have identified a more specific argument in the image. The Greek and Georgian churches mixed Eucharistic wine with water in the chalice, a practice derived in part from the John 1934 passage. The Armenian Church did not. It kept wine and water separate in its liturgy. By depicting one vessel collecting both streams, the Ganjasar painter was visually representing a practice that was not Armenian. The image does not resolve the dispute, it records it. Even in its visual tradition, the Armenian Church held open a question that its own liturgical practice had seemingly answered. 2 manuscripts, 2 centuries, 2 different scriptoria, one following John's account of who carried the cross, one encoding a Eucharistic debate rooted in a verse only John recorded, both preserving what the majority had not. The burial follows the death. Before the Sabbath begins at sundown on Friday, a member of the Sanhedrin goes to Pilate and asks for the body. All 4 Gospels record this man, a prominent member of the council, Mark chapter 15, verse 43, and a secret disciple of Jesus who feared the authorities, John chapter 19, verse 38. He buries the body in a new tomb cut from rock nearby. John chapter 19, verses 39 through 40, adds a figure the synoptics do not record. Nicodemus, a Pharisee who had come to Jesus by night years earlier, arrives with a mixture of myrrh and aloes, approximately 75 pounds of it, and helps wrap the body with spices in linen. Matthew, Mark, and Luke record no Nicodemus at the burial. John records no burial without him. The pattern that ran through every scene in this story, each gospel knowing something the others don't, runs through the tomb as surely as it ran through the garden and the praetorium. What the Armenian Acts of Pilate preserves is the official correspondence surrounding all of it. After handing Jesus over, the canonical Pilate disappears from the 4 Gospels. He grants the body for burial. He posts a guard at the tomb. He says nothing more, but the Acts of Pilate, in the version that Armenian scribes reproduced more widely than any other Passion text in their tradition, contains the formal report, the interrogation record, the account of the trial, and the epistle of Pilate, addressed to the Emperor Tiberius, describing what had been done and why. The document that the 4 canonical Gospels never mention. The letter from the prefect to Rome. Whether the epistle is a genuine first-century document or a later composition, scholarship has not decided. What is not in question is that Armenian Christians treated it as the former, copying it in monastery after monastery in the world's first Christian nation, while the Latin West had appended it to a narrative about the harrowing of hell, and the Eastern churches had largely let it rest. Armenia preserved the trial. Armenia preserved the letter. The tomb was sealed, the guard was posted, and the report, if it ever existed, had already been sent north. On the first day of the following week, the tomb was empty. All 4 canonical Gospels agree on the day. Mark chapter 16, verse 2, Matthew chapter 28, verse 1, Luke chapter 24, verse 1, John chapter 20, verse 1, all specify the first day of the week. They agree that women came to the tomb and found it open. They agree that something had happened there that overturned every expectation. Mary Magdalene is present in all 4 accounts, the first, or among the first, to encounter the empty tomb. Matthew, Mark, and John name her explicitly. Luke describes a group of women from Galilee, without listing her by name at that moment, though she appears elsewhere in his account. What she sees, what she is told, and what she does with it differ between the 4 writers, as every significant scene in this story has differed. Simon Peter ran to the tomb. John chapter 20 verses 1 through 10 records him arriving with another disciple, stooping to look inside, seeing the linen burial cloths lying where the body had been. Luke chapter 24 verse 12 records him going alone, looking in, and returning home, wondering at what had happened. He was around 30 years old, the fisherman from Bethsaida who had drawn a sword in an olive grove 3 nights earlier, denied knowing the man he had tried to defend 3 times at a fire in a courtyard, and now stood at the entrance of an empty tomb without yet understanding what he was looking at. That is where Peter's arc ends in the canonical record. Not with a declaration or a transformation, with wondering. The 4 Gospels then diverge on the resurrection as thoroughly as they diverged on everything before it. Which appearances happened, to whom, in what sequence, and where the disciples were instructed to go. The resurrection accounts cannot be assembled into a single agreed narrative, any more than the trial accounts could. But among the Armenian manuscripts of Mark, there is a divergence of a different kind, not about which witness remembered what, but about where the text of the Gospel itself ends. A substantial number of Armenian manuscripts of Mark terminate at chapter 16, verse 8. The verse reads, "They went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid." And then the Gospel stops. No further appearances. No commission to go and teach all nations. No ascension. The text ends at the moment of silence and fear, with women running from an open tomb. The longer ending of Mark, verses 9 through 20, includes what follows in most versions: Jesus appearing to Mary Magdalene, his appearance to 2 disciples on the road, his appearance to the 11, the Great Commission to preach throughout the world, and the Ascension. It is the ending most of Christianity inherited, and it is not found in Codex Vaticanus. It is not found in Codex Sinaiticus. Those are the 2 oldest surviving complete manuscripts of the Greek New Testament, both from the 4th century, and both end Mark's Gospel at verse 8. Eusebius and Jerome, writing in the 4th and 5th centuries, noted that the longer ending was absent from almost all Greek manuscripts known to them. Armenia's manuscripts are not alone. The earliest form of Mark, as translated into Latin, Syriac, Sahidic Coptic, and Georgian, also ended at chapter 16, verse 8. Across 5 languages and multiple independent textual traditions, the oldest recoverable layer of Mark concludes with women fleeing an empty tomb in silence. The longer ending appears to have been added in the 2nd century by a scribe who found Mark's abrupt conclusion insufficient and supplied a resolution the original had not provided. Armenia, by preserving a tradition that ends at 16:8, was not omitting the resurrection. It was preserving the oldest recoverable layer of the text, the same layer that Vaticanus and Sinaiticus preserve, the same layer the Syriac and Coptic translators worked from, the layer that predates the edition the rest of the world accepted as original. Here is what that means, alongside everything else in this account. The Armenian manuscript tradition copied the Acts of Pilate more widely than any other apocryphal passion text, an expanded trial record, an interrogation the 4 Gospels do not contain, a formal letter from the Roman governor to the Emperor Tiberius. That same tradition also preserved a resurrection account, shorter than the one most of Western Christianity received. More of the trial, less of what followed the tomb. Not because Armenian scribes were choosing one over the other, because they were translating from sources that predated the expansions in both directions, the Acts of Pilate giving them detail about the trial that the canonical record had not fully preserved, and the early text of Mark ending before the 2nd century edition that most of the Church eventually incorporated. They were not editing. They were inheriting. Today, 23,000 manuscripts and 500,000 documents sit in the Matenadaran in Yerevan. The Zeytun Gospels, manuscript 10,450, produced by Toros Roslin in 1256 CE, is among them, with folio 391 showing Christ carrying his own cross, because Roslin followed John's text rather than every painted convention that surrounded him. The Acts of Pilate was copied in those same scriptoria, not as a rarity, not as a document stored in private, but as one of the most common apocryphal writings in the entire medieval Armenian tradition, reproduced across generations in the oldest Christian nation on earth. The 4 canonical Gospels give us 4 incomplete accounts of the same week. They contradict each other on when the anointing at Bethany occurred, on whether the temple cleansing happened during the final week or years before it, on who arrested Jesus, on which trials he underwent, on who carried the cross, on who stood at the foot of it, and on where the risen Jesus first appeared. The trial, the proceeding that determined whether he lived or died, is recorded in 4 accounts, that each contains scenes the others omit entirely. The Armenian tradition preserved a 5th account of that trial, attributed in its manuscripts to James, the Lord's brother, containing the formal correspondence of the Roman governor to Rome. It was preserved by a nation that became Christian before Rome did, that translated the Bible from sources predating most Western manuscripts, and that reproduced a court document about the death of Jesus, while the Latin West had filed it under Apocrypha and moved on. The stone was rolled away on a Sunday morning. What was written down about the week that led to that morning depends entirely on who was doing the writing, in which language, from which sources, and in which country. The answer that was copied the longest in the world's first